And now, Deep Thoughts.
Whoa, that's pretty deep.
Hey, welcome to Deep Thoughts, a podcast that explores the Christian faith, sometimes deeply, and sometimes not so much. I'm your host, Matt Shantz. The technologies of our day are determined to keep us scrolling and swiping at all costs, plugged into a feedback loop of impatience, comparison, outrage, and contempt. Blind to the dangers, we enjoy its temporary pleasures, unaware of the damage to our minds, bodies, and souls. In this episode, we talk about the ways the digital age and its values affect the Christian life and our communal life, church life. To help me do that is my guest, Jay Kim. Jay lives with his family in Silicon Valley, California, and is the lead pastor of Westgate Church. He's the host of InterVarsity Press's Digital Examine podcast and Barna's Making Space podcast. He's the author of Analog Church, Analog Christian, and his most recent book, Listen, Listen, Speak, all of which we'll explore in this episode. So now, here's my deep conversation with Jay Kim. Well, hey, Jay, you're like the perfect guy to come on a show called the Deep Thoughts Podcast because you go by Jay Kim Thinks on like your social media accounts. So welcome to the Deep Thoughts Podcast, man.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah. That is my social media handle, and it gets misunderstood. It's not. I'm not saying nobody else thinks. It's just the stuff I'm thinking about. I don't know that they're deep thoughts. They're usually not deep thoughts. It's just stuff I'm thinking about. So
yeah, I put a little like disclaimer on the Deep Thoughts Podcast, like. Hopefully we get there on occasion, but it's no guarantee at all. So
yeah, that's right.
I want to talk to you about your book, Hack Your Fitness, The High Achiever's Guide to Getting Ripped in Under 3 Hours a Week. How do you do it?
It's my contribution to the world, you know.
Do you know about that book?
You know, multiple people have sent it to me. Yeah, multiple people. For those listening who are like so confused, there's an author named Jay Kim who wrote a book, a fitness book. That it is not me. We're not the same guy. And I've never met him. I don't know what he looks like, but I'm certain he looks a lot better than me. So yeah.
If anyone was ever confused and thought you actually wrote it, that'd be like a high compliment. It's a book about getting ripped.
Amazing. Yeah. No, people are never confused. They never make the mistake. They're just confused. They're like, how did you?
Yeah. Totally. I thought that was so good. Doing my research about you, I was like, oh, this is pretty great. But you have written some books, and you've written a couple books advocating for a more analog approach to life and to faith. And what's fascinating to me, I need to hear more on this, is you're writing books advocating for the analog life, but you're doing that from Silicon Valley, California, which has got to be like the tech capital of the world. So what's been that experience for you? Is it because you live there that you've started to write about the analog life? Or I just love to hear about living in Silicon Valley and writing about, let's go more analog, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm certain it's connected to the fact that I live here. I've lived here my whole life. So I've really watched it change. Before I was here, this whole valley was just orchards. And now, it's really, if not it is at least one of the tech capitals of the world. Mm-hmm. I live, like a 7-minute drive from Apple's big mega complex, the spaceship, and, 15 minutes from Google. So like the big mega tech stuff is here, as well as, you go up the peninsula a little bit and it's just startup culture. So many startups, lots of people in our church family who, a lot of people who work at Apple and Google and Meta, and then plenty who are, in startup world. I just had, I grabbed some drinks with a dear friend of mine who's a part of our church, and he's a founder of a pretty significant startup here in town. And so it's just kind of all around. And yeah, so I think because of that, one, just as a pastor, I'm thinking about it a lot because it's so pervasive and ubiquitous in modern life. And then I'm surrounded by men and women who are making the stuff that is so pervasive and ubiquitous, which leads to all sorts of really interesting conversations. So yeah, I mean, my geography, I think, is a big part of why I write what I write. But more than that, I think actually it's just several years ago, I began reckoning with my own digital addictions. I realized that I was digitally addicted, and came to a point where I just thought, this is not actually the life I want to live. And yet it happens to be the life that I'm choosing to live. And Jesus promises life and life to the full. And this life doesn't feel that full. So there's got to be a path forward. So that sent me on a long journey, and here we are. Yeah.
So, I mean, in one sense, there's nothing new under the sun. And yet I think the church in every generation has unique challenges to disciple making that exist there. What unique challenges exist for making disciples of Jesus in the digital age? You just talked about your own experience there, applying it to yourself, applying it to pastoring Christians. Like, what are the challenges that exist for disciple making in this kind of very digital world?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. If I had to whittle it down to just sort of concrete, a handful of bite-sized concrete summary ideas, I would say, the digital age runs on a few key primary values. I would say that they, at least three that I sense are primary is speed, choice, and individualism. In the digital age, everything has to be faster and faster. Like phone companies will never come out with a phone that is slower than the previous iteration. That would just make no business sense. Everything has to get faster and faster. We had 3G and then 4 and then 5 and then on and on. Like, that's just how it works. But discipleship to Jesus is by nature a slow and steady process. So that poses a tremendous challenge. We're growing increasingly impatient because everything is so fast and accessible. And yet following Jesus is a lifelong journey. And it's, agriculture is the primary metaphor of the New Testament. We grow fruit. We don't microwave TV dinners, as followers of Jesus. And fruit grows in season, and you have to wait, and you have to water and wait some more and make sure it has sunlight. And so that's a significant issue, I think. And then choice, I name any one thing and I can go online and find you 800 different options, right? That we can click a few buttons and pay our money. And then within a matter of days or weeks, it's at our front door. We just we're over inundated with a plethora of choice. And what choice does is it makes us shallow. You never have to sink deeply into any one thing because there's always another option. We live in a world of options, and that's problematic because the life of discipleship to Jesus is deep. It's a deep work. It actually has to stay, again, the metaphor of agriculture. You plant a seed and it grows deep beneath the soil. And over time, it grows roots deep beneath the soil. That's what makes a thing strong and alive and life-giving and generative. And, in the digital age, we are so tempted to move on to other options that we never grow deep roots. And that's problematic in our sort of formational journey of discipleship. And then, the internet is the promise of this sort of like global village that the internet made to us 30, 40 years ago. It's a lie. It's proven to be untrue. We are more disconnected and lonelier and more isolated than ever. The data bears that out. That's not like a pastor's, opinion. That like literal data bears that out, that we are so disconnected, so divisive, tribalistic, isolated, lonely, all of those things. It's undeniable at this point that the promise of a utopian global village was a farce. It's the internet has pulled us apart, not drawn us together. It's hyper individualistic. And of course it is, I control with the, swipe of a finger or the push of a button, I control how much or however little I want to engage. I can actually control who I follow, or some of the language of social media platforms, like I can friend and unfriend people literally by pushing a button. It's crazy. Yeah. So it's hyper individualistic, but the nature of discipleship is communal. You think about in Matthew's gospel, when he lists all of the 12 apostles, there's himself, Matthew, the tax collector, and then there's Simon the Zealot, and they would have been sworn enemies at that time. And here they are, just bound up together in the family of God as brothers. And it's too easy to not do that online. It's way too easy to be like, we have, he's going to vote for candidate X, and what an idiot, what a moron, unfriend or block or whatever. And that's really detrimental to the life of discipleship to Jesus. So those are some initial thoughts. I mean, there's so much more, but those are some initial thoughts that come to mind.
Absolutely. We need more than digital platforms alone. I agree with you. Like the data is in, like, it's a loneliness epidemic. Even just our attention spans are like waning. Our actual personal embodied relationships are so critical. And so as the people of God, like, we need more than digital platforms alone when it comes to the Christian life and community. I'm just wondering if you can just speak to, you talked about the agricultural metaphors we see in scripture all the time. Like, it's a slow growth into bearing fruit. What are you noticing that's symptomatic of the digital age affecting the church, affecting Christians in such a way that we're missing some of what it truly means to be embodied Christians and churches?
I mean, I think there's so much to say there. It's a wonderful question. One thought that comes to mind that I think Matt, as a church leader, I'm sure have sort of wrestled with and reckoned with in your own ways, as almost every church leader I know has in recent years. You think about COVID and the pandemic and global lockdown when we couldn't gather. And I'm sure your church did this, we all went online and did that whole deal. And it did something. I think it accelerated a thing that was already happening, which was that church was it was primarily understood and experienced by most people as a medium for Christian content. Yes. I go to church and then fill in the blank with whatever content of choice. I go to this church because I love the preaching, or I go to that church because the kids ministry is like off the charts and they do incredible whatever, or I go to this church because the music is just the best in town. I mean, it's marketplace language. Yeah. And what I am not saying is that quality preaching and, great worship and music and wonderful program for children and all life stages. What I'm not saying is that those things are unimportant. They really matter. They really matter. But I think that's actually, to go to church primarily motivated by that, is, again, it's a marketplace mentality. And that's not a biblical ecclesiology. The church is not a peddler of Christian products. The church is a people to whom we belong. And what happened during COVID was this sort of misunderstanding that was already sort of brewing beneath the surface. It just exploded because we had to go to a medium that is primarily a product content driven medium, which is the screen. And so without wanting to, we, intentionally or unintentionally sort of formed or accelerated the already, ongoing formation of this grave misunderstanding amongst the masses that church is about content. I mean, I have so many friends who during COVID, they were like, oh, because we're all watching online, I decided to watch Church X, Y, and Z because, and then just fill in the blank. The music is like so good, and the quality of the video was awesome, or the teaching, and that's fine. I'm not against that. I mean, I'm all for Christian content, absolutely. Like as a means of inspiration and teaching and equipping, it's like wonderful. Like I'm a part of that. I create, I guess you could qualify it as like Christian content, absolutely. But that is very different than the calling to belong to a body.
Yes.
Be a part of a local church community. I think that is one of the sort of non-negotiables of discipleship to Jesus, to belong to an embodied people with whom, the incredible speaker you watch on YouTube who pastors a church 4 states away. When your son gets really sick, that guy's not coming to your house to pray over your family. That's like your local community is going to do that. Your local pastor who knows you and loves you, who you know and love, regardless of the quality of their preaching or not. Like that's the person that's going to show up. And you look at not just like the book of Acts, but you just look throughout the scriptures and the story of the people of God. It wasn't just because they lived, in a pre-digital or pre-internet world. It's because that was the means by which God moved in and through his people. And that word through is key. You go to the early church and tells us that they had everything in common. I mean, like that's a part of the description of the early church. It's like they broke bread together. They did life together. They gathered constantly. Yeah. It's all analog,
intertwined.
Stuff, and so I think there's a significant misunderstanding that we have to sort of undo.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember coming out of the COVID time, and there was this resonance we had, which was like, we're never going to take this for granted again. The opportunity to actually gather, to be this embodied, have this presence with each other. It's like, we've kind of forgot, it's amazing. Like, and so there is this dilemma. I hear you saying, the substance of the content, or, excellence and striving to preach well, and our corporate singing be impactful. We're emotive beings. This should move us and draw us into like those things. Doing those things well matter, but there is a measure of approaching church, the community, as a consumer where we get it wrong. How are some ways that, you in writing Analog Church, some ways that you see we can intentionally recognize the digital world, what's going on, recognize our propensity towards being consumeristic about church? What are the kinds of things that you see a church can wisely build and disciple around to value the stuff that make us these New Testament congregations?
Yeah. There's a little thing I write in the book that has become sort of the paradigm or the lens for us. When we, as a church, when we ask the question, will we leverage digital technology for this, or will we not? We look at it through the lens of, again, our best understanding is we think that digital informs, but analog transforms. So what we say is like, man, if we need to inform our people, so, and maybe even inspire them. Digital can inform and even inspire, but transformation happens embodied in person as we show up shoulder to shoulder. So that's what we do. We have, like, our church has an Instagram and a website and Facebook and all those things. And we send weekly emails, and our church does podcasts as yours does, like all those things. We do all of that, but we do it with sober and clarity. We are doing this to inform our people, and we're informing them of opportunities. We're informing them of, deeper paths to belonging, where they can show up and in, again, analog, embodied, the theological term would be incarnational, in the flesh sort of ways, experience slow and steady transformation over the long haul. So I don't know how helpful that is for folks listening, but that's the paradigm we
Yep.
use. Like we're going to
That's great.
inform through digital, but we are always going to invite people to show up to experience transformation together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can't read the New Testament without recognizing I need to exist as a follower of Jesus in intertwined relationships with other Christians. Like all of the one another passages, for example, throughout the New Testament, of which there are dozens, they're always referring to local embodied fellow believers. Like, how do you forgive one another if you're not, if you're just watching content online? How do you bear one another's burdens? Like, how do you love one another? Like, actually do that. It's only in the context of community. There's no other way to read the New Testament than to recognize that it's a call to a localized congregation in living it out. I'm always looking for little tips and maybe rhythms. What would you say for just the average follower of Jesus who's listening, in terms of what's a healthy relationship with screens, with social media, that might help them bypass some of the real detriments that exist in the digital world? Are there any you put into practice that come to mind?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. There are some things I practice. I mean, you know, we're having this conversation at a really interesting time, actually. For a long time now, I have wanted to be off of social media completely. One of the reasons that I've stayed on is because of some of my more public work, not necessarily, you know, my primary responsibility, which is to my local church, but some of my, you know, writing books and such. And there's a whole thing with, I want to honor the partnership with publishers, and they're very big on like, oh, you got to post about it and stuff. So I've kept social media, but so one of the rhythms is, this is from Andy Crouch, who his work has been so helpful and informative for me. He suggests, you know, a rhythm of digital Sabbath. So it's very simple: 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, 1 week a year. So 1 hour a day, like a waking hour of your day, you know, like the 7-8 hours you sleep doesn't count. But a waking hour of the day, can you shut off intentionally all technology and just be embodied? And for me, that rhythm has turned into several hours a day. It's typically once I come home and I'm with my family, our phones and digital devices all get docked in the kitchen in a little charging area. And then that's it. That's where it stays, and we don't interact with it. We're human with one another, my wife and I and our 2 children. So it's more than an hour a day for us, but that's kind of an easy way to think about it: an hour a day, and then a day a week, an entire day a week. So for us, it's typically Saturdays, which is one of my 2 days off during the week, Friday, Saturday. And so on Saturday, when everyone's home, the whole day I'm off. I don't check email. I don't check social media, any of that. And then a week a year. And that week a year has actually, over the last few years, turned into multiple weeks a year. I typically take a couple of weeks of vacation in the summer with my family. And when I do that, I shut it all off. Now, I still have my phone for, you know, Apple Maps or Yelp to find a great coffee shop in whatever town we're visiting. But I delete everything. I delete social media. I delete my email off of my phone. I get rid of all of it. The news, all of that. I get rid of all of that. And I'm just using the phone as a functional mechanism to get from place to place and find great places to eat some food. So that's been really helpful. And that's turned into multiple weeks a year. I usually have it off completely during that entire vacation, whether it's 2 or 3 weeks. But we're having this conversation at an interesting time because of that habit, I've gotten to the place where, even though I still have social media by default because of some of the work that I do, I have found my appetite changing, where I long to be on it less and less. So I just recently, like this week, actually logged off of social media, and I told, you know, people I work with and partnerships with publishers and stuff, I logged off social media, and I'll be off until August, you know, for the next couple of months, few months. So, and I've never done that before for that long, but it's been, you know, 3 or 4 days, and I don't miss it at all. So
Nice.
I long for that day when I want to honor my partnership with different organizations, but yeah, the less I can be on it, the better. But it's an appetite thing, You have to really because I was once really addicted
Yeah.
to social media and all things internet, but it's possible. That's what I've learned. It's possible. We just have to go through the slow and steady process of rehabilitating ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask as you were starting to explain that, like, was that hard? And I think you're speaking a little bit there. It's an adjustment, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that I think addiction language is fair in the sense that, like, I forget what it's called. It was language Andy Crouch used as well. I had him on the podcast a few years ago now, but like, I think it's like the twitch or something like that, which is like, you might not even have your phone in your pocket, but it feels like it's ringing or alerting you. Like you get the feeling like it's happening when it's not even on your body. We're just so like wired for it and like respond right away. Like that's addictive, or at least it's like it's an impulse that just comes naturally to us. So was that weaning process hard? Like I think that's great. I've had a love-hate relationship with social media too. I've gone off for years, periods of time, and wonder about it fairly frequently. And so, yeah, like what's that process like? Does it take a bit of time? You just did you make the commitment and you stuck to it, or build to it?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably different for everybody. It's interesting about addiction. I think the majority of people listening are addicted, whether they know it or not. The data bears it out. I think it's like over 80% of people admit that they could not go one full day without their smartphone. 90% of smartphone users, one of the first things they do after waking up and one of the last things they do before going to bed is check their smartphone. Mm-hmm. So that's another practice that we have, again, from Andy Crouch. We treat our phone like we would treat a newborn child. We put it to bed before we go to bed, and we wake up before it wakes up. So, I like that. In our family, my wife and I, we have long stretches before bed. Like our phone does not sit on our nightstand. It's physically not possible for me in the morning to reach over and grab my phone to check whatever, Instagram or email or I physically can't do it because it's not there. And people are like, how do you wake up? It's like, there are these things called alarm clocks. You could still get them. Yeah. And there's some of them are really cool. So do that. That's what we've done. So it was, again, I just think it depends on the person. So for me, it was hard, but it wasn't as hard as I thought. And my appetite and my habits sort of acclimated quickly to the point where I actually much more desire being off it more than I desire being on it, if that makes sense. So, but again, I think it's different for everybody. So I think you have to go at a pace that really works for you. And I know that for many of us, it's connected to the work we do, and that can be hard. So you gotta be wise, about how you step away. But the less and less we can engage, I think the better. I mean, if I could just make blanket statements and invitations, the reality is I wish I could just tell everybody to get off social media completely. I just don't think it's helpful in any real meaningful way. I think it can be helpful. I just think most of the time the algorithms are designed to make them unhelpful, really.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Are we ever gonna, do you think we'll get to the point where we as a society realize how detrimental this is? Like it's affecting and maybe make broader changes? Or I would love to see the church be an apologetic in this moment, be a witness in this moment to say relationships in person really matter. Living life with other people really matters. And while people are very isolated and on their screens, and the algorithms are feeding this monster of like aggression and vitriol and folks are getting into their little echo chambers and silos of, this is the niche, like you were talking about earlier, of people that agree exactly with me, and those, whoa, that's a rogue comment, like unfollow, unfriend. Do you think it's possible at a societal level or at a church level to really, really advocate for another way? Because it's actually what the human heart really longs for. We need each other, but we're so digitally addicted, we're not functioning as well at simply interacting and having conversations. Like, social anxiety is growing because we don't know how to interact with each other. Just, I guess I'm speaking to the individual Christian listening, but I'm also church leader to church leader as well. Like, is there something for us to grab hold of in this moment?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. And what I've come down to, and I don't know that this will be a very satisfying response, but one big picture, I would say, yeah, it is possible. I think there is a better path forward. But it will demand collective effort, I found much more joy, though, and much more hope in thinking small. So yes, I long to see widespread reform when it comes to digital technology, on multiple levels, like literally from a policy standpoint, so like the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written extensively about this, and he's arguing for putting an age limit on social media, that it is truly a health crisis, not just mental health, but like a holistic health crisis for emerging generations. I agree with him. I think that we need to put an age limit on when a child can have, for example, an Instagram account. I really do. You look at some of the data about what Instagram specifically, and I'm not attacking it necessarily. I have an Instagram, our church has one, but just you think about the data about what Instagram does to young girls, especially. And I have a daughter, who just turned 9. And so she's entering that age where she'll be, in the next few years, she'll be asking. And my wife and I are both committed at this point, like no smartphone till she's out of our house. She'll have a dummy phone. So no social media, or if there is social media, it'll be closely monitored and on sort of a public desktop in our home where we can see. It'll be something like that, So, we're trying to navigate all of that. But where I have found the most sort of fulfilling progress is in much more sort of micro situations, like on the ground. So again, as an example, like my family, just trying to navigate how we're going to navigate it together. My own life and my own habits and practices, and then our small group, and getting together with the guys and just say, hey, can we commit to this, or can we commit to that? It's steps like that. And I think if enough people do that, we together collectively then cast a vision for the world and for culture at large of what might be possible, life and life to the full in a way that most of us are not currently living. And I think if we could do that, there are definitely more hopeful, brighter days ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Well, in your latest book, Listen, Listen, Speak, you talk about hearing God and being heard in the midst of, quote, the cacophony of chaos in our frenetically paced world. Again, you're talking specifically about communing with the living God and also communicating to others about the gospel, about God, about God's story. And in the context of chaos, noise, busyness, distraction. So just a couple closing questions here, and just on that idea of listening and speaking. What role does listening play in the Christian life? And how do we attune our ear to hear from God in such a busy, noisy world?
In many ways, I think the Christian life is the listening life. You think about the central text in Judaism, the Shema, which means to hear or to listen. Deuteronomy 6:4, right? Which Jesus himself quotes when he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? It's like, oh, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, Lord is one, love him with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. But that whole thing begins, and Jesus quotes it as such, like, hear, O Israel, Shema, O Israel. So in many ways, the life of following Jesus is a life of listening. It's hearing the voice of God speaking to us at all times and trusting that voice enough to follow steadily every step of the way in all of life. So noise poses a significant challenge, not just that we feel scattered and overrun. Noise poses a significant challenge in that it makes it more difficult for us to hear the one voice that we most desperately need to hear in order to follow. And so that's a big part of why I wrote the book. I was struggling to hear God amid all the noise, media noise and the noise in my own head and life situations and circumstances. But there is a way to hear him. And it's not really about volume. It's about clarity. There's not really much we can do about, the chaos and cacophony of a noisy world. Like, we don't really control that. But there is a way that we can sort of tune our frequency differently to hear with clarity. It's like the old radios and the knob, the dial, where you would just get static until you got to the right place and you tune to that frequency. And it's like, oh, there it is, like clear as day. And that's what we need to do every single day, every single day. And if we can do that, if we can get into the habit of tuning our hearts and minds and ears and our attention to God, then we will, in the midst of the static, in the midst of the chaos and the noise, we will hear his voice with clarity. And that's the voice we need most.
That is great. Jay, I just got to say, I love how you've written these books on analog Christianity and stuff. And I do hear you advocating for old school alarm clocks and radios with dials. It's just, you're nailing it, man. So here's another piece. The gospel's timeless, right? The gospel is timeless, and yet there really are timely ways that we can learn to communicate the timeless truth of the gospel effectively. There was a day when you could give out the 4 spiritual laws in a little booklet and here you go, and they'd open it and be like, wait, I am a sinner. I do need it. And it's just like, it doesn't compute in our moment. So listen, speak. What are some ways that we can communicate the gospel in our moment in such a way that will be heard over all the noise and opinions and approaches?
Yeah. And there's a lot to say there, like half the book, the second half of the book is about that. I think that maybe the most helpful thing I could say is that in our world, in the modern West, because of digital technology and the 24-hour news cycle and accessibility on our smartphones and like social media, I'm using air quotes because it's really dramatically not social. If you think about it, again, we're disconnected, not deeply connected. But because of that, there's this propensity to think that there's this comedian named Bo Burnham. He's got this special on Netflix called Inside, which he filmed by himself during the pandemic. And it's like, it's really sobering actually, and hilarious, but sobering and hard to watch at certain points. But he's got this whole bit he does in there where he's just like, does everybody all the time, everywhere need to say something about everything that's happening everywhere all the time in the world all the time? Like, is that a thing we have to do? You know? And when I watched that, I was like, oh my gosh, he is like, it's so simply and beautifully and hilariously putting his finger on the pulse of what so many of us feel.
Yeah.
But I actually think speaking in a way that can actually be heard means speaking like right here. I just had I had a conversation with a friend right before this conversation about politics and how, because of media and social media and our smartphones and our news feeds and the 24-hour news cycle, the overwhelming majority of us care so much more about national and global politics, things happening in parts of the world where we can do very little, beyond prayer. We care so much more, and we're so much more informed about that than we are about our neighborhood association or our city council and what's actually happening in our neighborhood in places where we can actually do something in Jesus' name for the good of all, and I mean, I'm not judging anyone. That's self-indictment. I do very little. I hardly ever go to city council meetings, even though I should, but I do go sometimes and try to get involved and, connect with our neighbors and gather at the little park in our neighborhood. And I've just found that to be so helpful. Like, I feel like really heard in those spaces in ways that I never feel on the internet. And, so I think God has put us, again, like in a digital world, it's so important to remember God has placed us in real places with real people at a real time in history for a particular reason. And the more we lose ourselves to these digital platforms and digital spaces that, pseudo connect us to like people and places that are so far from us, the more we do that at the, the more we neglect the real people and the real places that we're really called to.
Yeah, that's great. And even as we have these opportunities to speak with people right in front of us, something I've encountered in our moment that's effective is even in those embodied experiences and maybe telling people about Jesus, it goes all the way back to listening again too, because people so desperately want to be heard and understood. And some folks have baggage around Christianity, and just like, I'm here with you, willing to listen and willing to speak, but I want to know you. I want to hear you. And those are such vital tools right now. I'm a typical Canadian. I've been watching the hockey playoffs right now, and just the other day I was like seeing there was a shot of the players at the bench and the coaches at the bench. And I mean, those are like the most expensive tickets you can get, like right behind the benches. And 9 out of 10 people in the frame were looking down at their phones as they're in like the spot I would like close to kill for, dial it back a bit. I'm a pastor, but like I'd be like, man, that's an amazing spot you're in. And they're down looking at their phones. And it's just like, oh my gosh, we need presence. I just think one of the ways I like to think of the Bible is this one giant quest where God is trying to get us back into his presence. It starts in the garden with presence. It ends in a garden city, like presence, and you will be with Jesus, and everything else, tabernacle, holy of holies. What is it? It's God's presence with us. It's led by a pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, presence of God represented in that. What is the coming of Jesus at Christmas? Incarnation. What is it? It's the presence of God coming to us in order to save us. And so we're desperate for the presence of God in our lives. We were made for it. Yeah. And we were made in the image of God to embody presence with other image bearers of God. And our souls, it's like the Grinch. It's like our hearts grow sizes when we actually live out the way we were made to live, which is in that kind of fullness, which look, there's a space for the digital world. I get to talk to you. You're in California. I'm in British Columbia. I get to have this conversation with you because of technology. I'm thankful for it, but man, it cannot ultimately replace those sorts of deep, this is what we were made for stuff. So, hey, I'd love to just give you the final word. It's been an amazing conversation. What do you got, Jay?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, I guess my encouragement would be, Dallas Willard had this wonderful line in a book that, was one of the key inspirations for me in writing my most recent book. He wrote a book called Hearing God that I've read multiple times. And continue to reread, every few years. So helpful. He's got this wonderful, for me, what was a paradigm shifting line that I'll just paraphrase here. He essentially says, our inability to hear God when we want to hear God is due to the fact that we do not, in general, want to hear God, and only want to hear God when we think we need to hear God.
Wow.
So that would be my encouragement. If you want to hear the voice of God, live a listening life where you reorient your desire and your listening desire to want to hear him all the time, not just when you think you need him. Because the truth is, he's always speaking. It's just that we don't recognize his voice. So in those moments when we think we need him to speak, it's not that he isn't. It's just that we don't know how to hear him. And there's a way out of that, and that is to live a listening life, to listen for him all the time. So that would be my encouragement. God's speaking to you right now. And if you would just tune your ears, the frequency of your heart and mind, you'll catch his voice eventually.
That is such a good word. It's official, everybody. J. Kim thinks. Thanks for a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
So fun. Great being with you.
I think what we really need is a theology of technology. I'm convinced that sorting out a healthy relationship with technology is actually determinative as to whether or not we will actually have a vibrant relationship with Jesus and vibrant relationships with other people. I hope this conversation with Jay helped you see the need for a more analog life and also provided some practical helps in getting there. Thanks for listening to Deep Thoughts. I hope it helps you in fostering deep faith.